Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the role of local energy systems in unlocking flexibility, the first in our Future Energy Systems series. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's webinar. You've joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. You will have the opportunity to submit your questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. You can send in your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end or afterwards via email. I would now like to introduce today's first presenter, Andrew Lever from the Carbon Trust.
Good afternoon, everyone, and yes, welcome to the first in a series of 3 webinars that explores the role of flexibility in the GB energy system. My name is Andrew Lever. I'm a director here at Carbon Trust and lead our work in energy systems. I'm also pleased to introduce Rick Curtis from the Greater London Authority and Steve Atkins from the Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks who will be joining me today in today's webinar. And today's theme, we will explore the role of flexibility in local energy systems. We'll start with an introduction to flexibility, and I'll give a brief overview of our Flexibility in Great Britain project. And we'll then hear from today's speakers, Rick and Steve, who will share their work and perspectives on flexibility, and then flow into the discussion chaired by our very own Manu Ravishankar. There will, of course, be an opportunity to submit questions during the discussion through the chat function. Next slide, please. So what is flexibility and why do we need it? Well, Ofgem's definition of flexibility is, as you can see, modifying generation and or consumption patterns in reaction to an external signal, such as a change in price to provide a service within the energy system. In many other ways, I mean, flexibility quite simply allows us to do more with less. And this is increasingly important as we transition to net zero and become increasingly reliant upon more intimate forms of generation, of course, and we adapt to changes in demand patterns and even across vectors, for example, introduction of electric vehicles. As you can see here from the slide, I mean, there's 4 main points we've pulled out here that flexibility can play a role in, of course. The first being it allows network operators to reduce or even defer network reinforcement costs. It, of course, allows greater use of renewable generation capacity. It helps improve system stability and reliability. Coming back to that statement I made around flexibility allowing us to do more with less, of course, flexibility enables us to meet net zero more cost effectively, and that's really important because of the significant investment that's going to have to happen in the energy infrastructure to meet net zero. Next slide, please. So I think we know flexibility can add value, and the first 2 bullets on this chart can summarize, as you know, perhaps Carbon Trust published 2 reports in 2016 on the value of flexibility to the electricity system, and followed that up with a least regrets approach to investment in flexibility. And these provided a very clear articulation of the value of flexibility in that future energy system and gave some insight into what an optimal portfolio looks like, given uncertainties, as we all know, as to how the energy system will develop. And of course, since then, the decarbonisation of heat and transport sectors has now come much more into focus. Given these developments, we've seen an increased interest across sector in understanding the role and value of flexibility. But what we don't know yet, and what we want to explore is, well, how much more valuable flexibility is in meeting net zero? How does that compare to a previous analysis which just looked at an 80% reduction in carbon emissions? We want to understand how flexibility across the gas and electricity networks interacts. We want to understand what is the role of flexibility in decarbonising heat and transport and can there be ways where that can take costs out of those decarbonisation pathways across those sectors. And of course, very important is what are those new commercial business models that are required for flexibility to help meet those net zero targets. And that's really important for the investment community, of course. Next slide, please. So to address these questions, as some of you may well be aware, we started the Flexibility in GB project, which in short its aims are to develop that robust evidence base to support continued deployment of flexibility technologies in a cost-effective way, to provide direction to industry and policymakers on the role of flexibility in a cost-effective energy transition. And it's really important, of course, that evidence base is the backbone to allow industry and policymakers, of course, to make those decisions in a confident way. And importantly, of course, to explore those business models for flexibility and the requirements that need to be met to make them deliverable and, of course, viable. Well, of course, you'll see from this chart, there's a range of energy sector stakeholders whom we've convened and are supporting the project, including the Western Power Distribution, of course, Scottish Southern Electricity Networks, the Institution of Gas Engineers and Managers, EDFs, the Terra Energy, UK Power Networks, Scottish Power Energy Networks, Bright Energy, SBM Offshore, and of course the Greater London Authority, supported by the Mayor of London. In addition to that, we've also set up an external stakeholder group, which includes the various and relevant departments at BEIS and Ofgem, the Committee on Climate Change, the National Infrastructure Commission, and National Grid ESO. We're very keen to align with current policy and regulatory development to ensure that evidence base can be impactful and helpful. We are again supported by Imperial College London, whom we've worked with on previous projects, and will be providing the modelling support for this particular project. The project's already underway, has been for a couple of months now, and we're looking to conclude by March 2021 next year. So just gives you an overview of hopefully our ability to address some of those questions around flexibility and update that analysis and give very strong steer and direction to government and to industry. So I'm now very pleased to hand over to Rick from the Greater London Authority to share his perspectives on flexibility. So over to you, Rick.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Delighted to be here and able to share a few insights from London. Yeah, so if I could just jump to the next slide, please, that first slide. Thank you. So I'm mindful we have a broad audience here today, so I'm just going to give a very brief overview on how local energy systems and flexibility fit in with the Mayor's wider decarbonisation objectives and policies. I think, as you're all aware, the Mayor's key commitment is for London to be a zero carbon city. At the moment, that's by 2050, although as some might be aware, he has indicated additional ambition there, which will be confirmed over the coming months or at the next election. But to reach zero carbon, whatever that is, the bottom line is we need to pull out all the stops, including working with national government efforts. And obviously both local energy and flexibility are a key part of that strategy. The Mayor has an explicit target to supply 15% of London's energy from renewables by 2030, and a number of his programmes support this, including his heat network expansion strategy and all the way ranging to the London Community Energy Fund, looking to try and get community energy projects off the ground. But in addition to this, there's a firm commitment and recognition in the strategy of the need to plan and coordinate across the different energy vectors, and that means integrating across the built environment, low carbon heat and increasingly electric transport sectors. The key point here is that flexibility is absolutely critical to being able to do that. As you alluded in the introduction, Andrew, helping to maximise the use of local generation and avoiding the cost of upgrades as we move to that zero carbon world. A lot of studies, this one included, the GB Flex project and others such as the National Infrastructure Commission, they've clearly confirmed the importance of flexibility in delivering that quickest, lowest cost decarbonisation. And also, they show to a degree that much of that is optimally deployed at the local level. But in addition to that important value that local flexibility can provide to the national system, it's clear there's also value for the end user and city as well when that's built in locally. And we have to find a way of capturing that. So if we could just go to the next slide, I'll give a little bit more thinking on how we started to look at that through the Flex London project. So By way of a very brief overview, Flex London was the Mayor's first foray into trying to understand where the flexibility potential is in London and what its role is in unlocking and accelerating it. There were 2 phases, the second of which ended in March this year, and the aim was to identify and work with energy demand owners who had a flexibility challenge. So that could be anything from a desire to expand and make better use of electric vehicle infrastructure on site, or potentially make more efficient use of underutilized solar assets, potentially through the addition of storage. But regardless, whatever the challenge, the aim was to bring these potential projects together with a large roster of flexibility solutions providers that could help them identify the optimal solution for their challenge. The goals of Flex London were firstly to attempt to identify some commercially viable solutions that are ready to deploy or scale now across London. And for that reason, we didn't provide capital or upfront funding to projects. But the second one, the core objective, was really to try and better understand this idea of flexibility value that these projects can deliver, including some of the barriers that the Mayor can help to remove, hopefully. So there was some success. We did identify 3 or 4 flexibility use cases which are viable now and replicable. A number of those are in feasibility or in the delivery phase right now. But it's fair to say that there are a number of barriers that need to be addressed if we're going to unlock the full potential of local flexibility. So a quick look at the slide, in front of you now, gives a bit of insight on the range of flexibility value. Bottom line is, if you can add and build in that flexibility, it brings a lot of value to the end user, the city, and also the system. But right now, it's very hard to access all of that value. And actually, the value you could accrue largely depends on where you are in the system. In Flex London, we found that a number of business cases that we looked at weren't able to stack up as they were struggling to build a long-term revenue stream. Another key finding was that a lot of the value, varies locally, particularly the DSO value, meaning, right now it's a bit of a postcode lottery, in terms of accessing that value. And then the final point, I think, which was, we did see some of the specific benefits that accrue to the city are actually non-energy values, and right now they're very, very hard to build into the business case. So by that I mean that a lot of the projects generated a carbon saving, so potentially by shifting away from high carbon to low carbon, but right now there was no way of incentivizing and rewarding that, financially speaking. Similarly, often it's clear that there are explicit air quality benefits associated with the project, removing diesel gen sets, as an example, or removing cars and moving to electric vehicles. But again, it was very hard to realize some of that value. So potentially, these raise some really interesting questions about the role of the city. I guess the question to ask is, if there had been a revenue stream for carbon reduction or air quality, for example, could this and would this have tipped the business case for more flexibility projects to have happened that haven't otherwise? If we could move on to the third slide now, that would be great. So Flex London has highlighted that there is a role for the city to begin to unlock a pathway to flexibility, and quite clearly there's a cost of not doing so, both to the local system, where you can get suboptimal deployment of assets and miss out on the opportunity to drive other benefits like clean air and lower carbon, but also to the national system, as integrating across vectors and incorporating local energy at the local level has a key role in the national system's efficiency, driving down costs for all. Something that the GB project clearly is going to shed some more light on, and we really welcome some of those findings coming through there. Clearly London can't act alone here, which is why sitting in these groups is really, really key, and it's keen to join up and have a national discussion on flexibility. But there are actions that we can take now, and essentially, while we sort out some of those, wider long-term market structures, there are things that we can do. And so I guess just to run through a few activities the GLA are looking at the moment. Over the past year, taking some of the Flex London learnings, we've started to scale some of those replicable, viable use cases and business models that I referred to, and we're building them in now where possible. So that's across our GLA delivery programs, so including our retrofit programs, integrating into our London plan thinking. So that's essentially our sort of spatial development guidelines for all new development in London. So how do we sort of get buildings flexibility ready, so that they're future-proofed and able to interact and participate in the future system. And building this in now, clearly is cost effective, and as I mentioned, is really, really valuable for future proofing, even if some of that value isn't able to be realized, at this moment in time. I think other work we're doing, we're continuing to work with the DNOs to deliver local flexibility as an alternative to network reinforcement. UKPN and SSEN, in particular, have made, both have made huge progress here lately. UKPN, in particular, have been working with them on some of their, local energy markets, and there's more work to do there. And I think, a final area of activity is trying to better understand the roles and challenges associated with building in all this thinking at a very local level. So we started conducting local area energy planning pilots, and we've got one underway at the moment in the Isle of Dogs. And this will help us to understand what are the tools and actions needed locally to unlock this, and what's the role of the different organisations that come together here. Including how do these local activities fit in with the rest of the UK system. The bottom line is there's no national one-size-fits-all approach to this, but we do know some things. We know that heat and transport will be very local, and that needs integrating at a very local level. So what's the role for local authorities here, alongside organisations like the GLA to support Ofgem and the DNOs? And I guess that also raises some implications for what are the powers and resources that then need to be sort of passed on and delivered to local authorities to enable them to do that. What is clear though is that closer collaboration between Ofgem, the DNOs, and regional and local authorities is needed for us to ensure that a whole systems approach is taken into consideration. So I think I guess I'll probably pause there. I'm mindful that's a very quick overview of the Flex London findings. We're currently writing up the findings. We will be releasing a report there that will be accessible to all, and obviously I think my details are at the end or can be passed out as part of the presentation. So if you've got any questions, please do get in touch. So I think that was it. Perhaps hand back to you, Andrew.
Yeah, super. Thanks very much, Rick. And yeah, you raised a few questions there, which I'm sure we'll start to get into in the discussion later. Thank you. So next, very pleased to be joined by Steve Atkins, who joins us obviously from Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks. Over to you, Steve. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Rick. If we can move to the next slide, please. I just thought I'd give an indication of SSEN's progression on flexibility and how that's moved forward, and then to talk about that in the role of local energy systems. This first side is really just to kind of say that flexibility for us isn't a recent initiative. As far back as 2011, we instigated an active network management scheme in Orkney. And we also looked at new ways of connecting generation in terms of using flexibility to accommodate generation on a constrained network, making sure we could kind of squeeze as many people in as possible. And but that's shifted in as early as 2013, integrating that flexibility with a local energy system. So in 2013 on Shetland, we actually balanced that generation with smart storage heating and water heating in order to absorb some of that generation. And then in 2016, we started to look outside of the network for third parties to deliver flexibility to defer traditional network reinforcement. So it's been quite some time that we've been looking at flexibility as a way of mitigating the need for reinforcement or to defer reinforcement and to reduce costs on the network. And over recent years, we've been going out to try and to secure flexibility, but it's been an extremely nascent market, and it's not been without its difficulties. If we go to the next slide, we are getting to the stage now where flexibility is business as usual, in particular in the islands and in Scotland, where we have a number of constraints. We're utilising flexibility in business as usual conditions. So we've actually been going out for three products for planned outage, for post-fault, and for fault restoration. And the aim of those services is to reduce the cost of outages for all customers, to reduce the reliance on fossil fuels in system of normal conditions, such as utilising mobile diesel generators, and increase the number of financial benefits to distributed generation connected to our system, giving them alternative sources of income for their operation. We're currently looking at a total of 15 zones in the north, and also additional zones in the south, where we're going out to look for these look for people that can provide us with those services, and we identify those needs and secure services through procurement-based tender. We utilise platforms such as Piclo to find projects that can apply, and both existing and in development projects can apply dependent on the need. And once procured, we then instruct distributed generation to export or for demand side response to reduce import during a network event, and that's managed by our control room, and we pay for services based on being available and the amount and duration of the response. And those boxes on the right-hand side just give you an illustration of one particular project. It was in 2019, we placed our first economically viable constraint managed zone contract on the Isle of Islay for 6 megawatts worth of services. And that's, you know, doesn't seem huge, but if you actually look at what that's generated, that single project, in terms of over 1,250 tons of carbon dioxide saved versus conventional network support, cost saving of over 230,000 against traditional alternatives, and 5 gigawatt hours secured across 3 months of operation. So that's the equivalent of powering 120,000 homes for a week. So it just demonstrates the kind of real benefits of flexibility. Principally, that's that's for a network basis. But if we move to the next slide, this kind of demonstrates the wider impact. And you know, those examples that I've used are kind of geographically isolated demonstrations of local energy systems, but what we're keen to demonstrate within SSEN is how we integrate a smart grid where many of those local energy systems are operating in a single area, across a wide range of technologies. So we've got 2 projects operating in the Oxfordshire area. A project Leo, which is Local Energy Oxfordshire, which is bringing together a whole range of partners from Oxfordshire, including the city and county councils, the universities, local community groups, and commercial ventures as well. And they're looking at things like microgrids, EV and transport hubs, vehicle to grid, solar, renewables, heat networks. And it's how, as a distribution network, we can integrate all of those entities and allow them to operate. A secondary project that's run alongside that is Transition, which is us looking at how we deliver a management system that can facilitate that market and allow the value of local energy systems and those projects to be realised by the local communities. So on the left, you can kind of see the structure there, where those commercial entities bring those what we're calling kind of plug and play projects together, and we can facilitate those as a network. So just to summarise then, as I said, our kind of history of that goes back some time, but we're keen to pull those things together now and actually demonstrate tangible benefits within real life communities, where we can see local energy systems actually reducing costs for customers, facilitating consumption of energy generated energy at source, and supporting resilience in the networks. Thank you, Andrew.
Great, Steve. Thank you very much for that run through. So we'll move into the next part of our kind of webinar just now, which is our panel discussion. And so I'll hand over to my colleague Manu Ravishankar, who will take us through the discussion. And just a reminder that, of course, if you do have a question, then please do submit it through the chat function on the webinar. Manu.
Great, thanks, Andy. Hi, everyone. Hope everyone is keeping safe and well in these times. So my name is Manu Ravishankar, and as a personal introduction, I work as a senior manager in the energy systems team at Carbon Trust with Andy. So as part of my role, I work with local authorities quite a lot, actually, on areas such as battery storage integration, around kind of broader flexibility strategy, electric vehicle transition strategies, and actually more recently on a concept called energy innovation zones, which essentially is a kind of structured framework to shape and deliver local area energy innovation and economic development programs. And on the other side, I do a lot of work with DNOs as well. I've designed and delivered innovation projects, ranging from consumer engagement tools to risk assessment frameworks for understanding the value of novel flexibility technologies such as storage and demand-side response. And I'm really interested in kind of bottom-up innovation models and particularly how they can help accelerate the net zero transition. So yeah, really quite excited to discuss this topic with Steve and Rick, given their experience and expertise. Given that we've heard, I guess, quite some details from Rick and Steve in terms of the projects they've been involved in and kind of how they've approached flexibility. I want to take a step back and get some views from what I consider two key stakeholders in this sector, a DNO and a local authority. And so that we can start to stitch together a better view of what we think local energy systems are, how they're developing, and the role of flexibility in them, given the objective of the webinar. And I'm sure people dialed in will be interested. And I'll say it again, and apologies for the repetitive message. If you do think of questions, I can see questions starting to come in. I'm sure more questions will get triggered as we run through this discussion panel. Please type them up in the chat box. My colleagues and I are keeping an eye out on that, so we'll pick them up at the end of the discussion. So moving into the discussion, I want to start off, quite simply, actually, in terms of the definition of local energy systems. And I want to get some quick views from you, Steve and Rick, in terms of how each of you see and frame local energy systems, because from the work that I've been involved in, I see these manifest at different levels, at different scales, different technologies, and people have different definitions for them. And I still find the current definition of this a little bit fuzzy. So maybe, Steve, if I can start with you, from a DNO's perspective, what do you really consider as a local energy system? And from the projects and the developments that you described and you've been involved with, are there any kind of common themes emerging that you'd note as kind of factors that you'd see as a local energy system?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, we're really looking at local energy systems in a very kind of wide definition basis, that they aim to match energy supply and demand within a defined area for the benefit of a particular group of stakeholders. So for us, at distribution level, it could be schemes initiated by us to mitigate the need for reinforcement, for example, using generation to smooth a demand peak or demand side response, or it could be third parties looking to consume local generation at source, such as community groups or local authorities. I think our observation is the market for these emerging sort of local energy systems is fairly nascent. So often they are driven by values other than simply profit. So for example, low carbon, net zero, and that's why we're seeing a high level of interest from community groups and local authorities. And I think as natural monopolies, networks have a duty to support their endeavours, because often community groups and local authorities, don't have the the resources or the capability in sometimes to kind of indulge in these markets. So we're kind of looking at support from an education side, trying to help streamline processes, because we understand that engaging with networks can be fairly bureaucratic sometimes. I think data is a key one as well. There's an awful lot of data that these entities need to be able to understand how best to maximise the opportunity. So we're spending quite a bit of time engaging with community groups and the energy hubs and LEPs that support local authorities. And then from a commercial perspective, most businesses operating in this sphere have to be able to stack revenues from a number of sources to make participation available. So we're kind of aware of not restricting the opportunities or to make that harder, but the requirements for commercial entities above and beyond that are broadly similar: data and visibility. I think those are the kind of key aspects.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, that's super helpful to kind of kick off how I guess DNOs are kind of looking at local energy systems. Maybe moving to Rick. I think Steve outlined this. It can either be something that's initiated by the DNO, or it's an external, and there can also be kind of non-monetary triggers or incentives to develop local energy systems, and then DNOs still have to play that enabling role, supporting that development. From a local authority's perspective, how would you frame local energy systems, and how do you think it kind of differs from perhaps what Steve has articulated?
Thanks, Manny. Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a difficult one to answer, isn't it? I think in my view, it's perhaps not too helpful to be too prescriptive on the definition. I mean, obviously you do need some clarity there, and I think anything it can really range from below the sort of distribution license area all the way down to to the household. I guess there's systems, a number of systems from the household to the streets, perhaps to the ward or the borough, and then, as I say, all the way up to that distribution level. And I think all of them need to be considered individually, as their own system. But then what we're seeing critically is then all together as a whole, to make sure that they all integrate together. So I think from a pure sort of definition perspective, I think, as I say, not being too prescriptive is quite helpful for that. But that said, and I think I echo many of Steve's points. I think there are some key characteristics which I think we could all agree on. The first one is that local element, and that that has real implications. I think the clue's in the name. It really requires bottom-up engagement, and on the basis that there is no one size fits all, and that every local area is different in terms of its, I guess its renewable potential, its assets, its businesses, its types of, resident that live there, the local authority in place. All of those sort of actors that have to be the ones that come together and start to drive this, or at least engage in it, so that they've got the right skills and resources to work with DNOs and others. And I think I alluded to the pilot we're looking at local area energy planning. For me, that principle is a really key one, because it's one of the first times where we can really clearly see the role and start to better understand the role of those local people that actually live in the area where the change is going to happen. I'd echo Steve's points around data, and I think just the final thing I wanted to mention was just another common theme we've seen is this blurring of roles, and often it does take quite a lot of different solution providers and different viewpoints to create a local system. So even if you're looking at a discrete project, perhaps looking at maximizing some solar panels, by considering storage or looking at other demand side response opportunities. The number of different specialties that need to come together there, is considerable. So that could be, someone putting in the data and, the sort of monitoring equipment to get the data out. That could be someone, a solar engineer putting in the solar panel. There could be if it's linked with buildings, there could be a sort of building, optimization algorithm in place, another platform to sort of link it to external network services. These are all just really, a lot of different stakeholders have to come together, and I think there's a lot of learning there that we're all going to, we've all got a lot more to do.
Brilliant. Thanks, Rick. I think that's super interesting. And maybe just to quickly summarize before I kind of move on, I think from both the answers, it feels like, yeah, local, as you said, the clue's in the name. I think anything we're talking about kind of distribution level below, definitely bottom up kind of citizen actor engagement, and definitely tailored, that it's not a cookie cutter approach. You want to kind of do something that works for the type of industry, the type of people, the type of kind of energy system that you have, and something that's probably underpinned by local area energy planning, that's data enabled, and that kind of brings together kind of multiple actors with different kind of skill sets into that. And in terms of who coordinates that, I guess, is another question which will come on quite later. But I think that starts to make it a little bit less fuzzy in my head, at least. So maybe moving on then, just to, I think, dig a little bit more into kind of local energy systems, kind of definition and framing. I always find it quite useful to see them in the development of wider context, because of course they don't exist in a vacuum. They kind of fit in with other things that are going on, and they enable it to some extent. Maybe Rick, if I kind of start with you here, how do you see the development of local energy system fit in with the kind of wider trend of decentralization and devolution? How does it interface with those trends?
I think it's really, both those trends are really critical in driving the changes we're seeing. I think from a decentralization perspective, it drives, of course, this transition away from top-down centralized fossil fuel, system to this reliance on more intermittent and decentralized renewables, and the need to make those renewables work. So, as we've heard, flexibility is essential for maximizing the value of renewables, getting the most out of them, but also integrating them into this wider system. One that's increasingly going to have, electric heat and transport. So again, coming back to the last question, I think the onus is on that local deployment and integration that needs to take place. And then I think coming on to the devolution question, really because of that local activity that needs to take place. So, we're seeing that flexibility technologies in many instances are best deployed locally, including for some of the national system benefits. There's also this, the local know-how and engagement we've talked about, and the resource that's required there. Well, that, the obvious answer is that that's, best placed, at least partly, with the local and regional authorities that are there. And obviously it raises the question, if efforts at the local level are generating, value for the national system, there's a question, as to how the national system then rewards that effort, or at least makes sure the right skills and resources are in place, to work alongside, other traditional system actors. And I think, again, that will be a really interesting question. We're seeing that play out a little bit on, some of the RIIO-2 working group discussions. And, I think it will hopefully come out sort of clearly through the, some of the GB Flex work. I guess the other two areas that are interesting there that we haven't touched on is the other two Ds, digitalization and democratization. And I'm sure we'll come on to them, shortly, in terms of looking at some of the sort of barriers and how we need to unlock that.
Great, thanks, Rick. So yeah, it seems like quite important for the decentralization and probably quite important consideration for the ongoing devolution kind of discussions. So moving on to Steve, then, I mean, again, to place it in the context of kind of the wider environment, DNOs themselves are going through a period of very significant transition, that they move to a DSO. So how do you see the emergence of local energy systems interface with that transition?
Yeah, the emergence of local energy systems and this kind of DNOs transforming to take more responsibility for the flow of electricity on the network, as well as the assets that carry it, goes absolutely goes hand in hand. I think the inherent flexibility in these systems offers an opportunity for networks to smooth pinch points on the grid without resorting to simply building more or bigger assets, which potentially reduces costs for customers. And consumption of energy closer to the source of generation can also mean a reduction in network losses, an increase in local resilience, and possibly cheaper electricity. So the benefits of DNOs transitioning to to enable a smarter grid aren't simply, you know, internal to DNOs. There's much wider benefits there. And you know, if you look at many future energy scenarios, they point at the bulk of UK generation being connected to the distribution network in 15 to 20 years. So facilitating local energy systems will be a key task for DNOs in future price controls. And I saw a question around, you know, the involvement of Ofgem on that, and we're working closely with Ofgem to ensure that that's reflected in our requirements going forward in our price control periods.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Steve. I think, yeah, that's coming out, I think, yeah, pretty clear in terms of, I think, yeah, there's a solid interface, and as you said, the one is the benefits to the DSO, but other than using local energy systems to unlock value for wider customers, I guess it's a key part of that. Yeah, which makes a lot of sense. So moving on to the kind of next few questions that I have. As the kind of webinar, of course, is about the role of flexibility, I want to kind of bring it back to that question specifically. And Steve, if I can kind of start with you this time around, I think it is really interesting to hear the work, you know, around constraint managed zones and the kind of, you know, the evolution as you kind of framed it, and the flexibility auctions. You know, as I understand it, it's a, you know, flexibility is a good way of kind of reducing the risk of standard network assets when you have kind of uncertainty in demand growth in certain areas, and it can give you good option value, etc. And then you also mentioned that it's kind of a nascent evolving sector in some places, a supply of flexibility. Does local energy systems and flexibility associated with that kind of help you access it more effectively?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a sort of a virtuous sort of quid pro quo. You know, if we're able to secure flexibility from a local energy system, then the additional income to the operators may mean the difference in terms of viability, particularly if it's a community scheme or local authority scheme. And that's why we're trying to do a lot of work to support new entrants to the flexibility market, particularly those participants that aren't used to tenders and procurement processes and all of that. You know, if we deliver a smart grid where, you know, the current sort of large incumbents in the balancing mechanism, you know, are still the main players going forward, then we've absolutely failed. You know, we need to open up these markets to smaller participants that can deliver that at distribution level.
Great. Thanks, Steve. I think that's pretty clear. In terms of, I mean, Rick, I think kind of similar question to you. You know, quite interesting to hear of what you outlined in terms of, you know, Flex London and the learnings. What are some of the key learnings, I guess, in terms of the role of flexibility, and kind of how does it help you to develop local energy systems?
Yeah, I think really I think there's a few areas where we know where flexibility is going to have that value, and I think, you know, we've talked about some of the benefits there. You know, building in the right flexibility, you know, in the right places has a lot of local benefits, and depending on the use case, there'll be some specific benefits there. So that could be better utilizing, you know, your electric vehicle assets, you know, to avoid those costly, you know, upgrades. It could be maximizing, you know, generation on site. But I think, you know, and obviously, again, you know, as Steve alluded to, there is that value that we see, and it's increasingly important value that the DNOs, you know, provides to the DNOs, and that will provide some revenue back to the end user. But I think, you know, there are still some challenges with that. I mean, looking at the sort of, because of the sort of the nascent nature of the of local flexibility markets, they are still a little bit of a postcode lottery at the moment. And you know, what we're finding, and I think that the DNOs are the first to sort of admit this, is that the DSR revenues, you know, or for network services, all the revenues that DNOs are able to provide are really the cherry on top, you know, in many cases, and only part of the value of flexibility. And I guess it's just this idea that I think we've only really scratched the surface of trying to understand what the role of flexibility could be if we were to visualize it and conceptualize it, you know, in another way. I mean, this is all, as Andrew alluded at the start, it's all about really trying to better match supply and demand in real time. And another area we're starting to explore and think about is this area of using flexibility as a tool to decarbonize. So essentially, if you could find a sort of methodology that could, I guess, sort of identify the color of your power in real time. So whether it's sort of high carbon or low carbon, and then you could get some sort of incentive attached to that. You could essentially see, a tool whereby you're shifting away from high carbon to low carbon. And flexibility really kind of becomes a tool to go far further than some of the ways we're looking at it today. So I think it's really, really exciting. And again, all these discussions, the evidence of the GB Flex project, is the first starting point there, and we need to understand, where the value is. But I think there's a lot that we can still explore, and it'll be very interesting to sort of see where this goes.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Rick. I think the message is quite clear that there's a lot of value in flexibility in kind of enabling the local energy system. And as I think Steve and Rick alluded to, I think there's two DNOs, and there's a lot of work that's been going around to kind of help unlock that. And it feels like there's still a long way to go in terms of truly unlocking the potential of both local energy systems and specifically the value of flexibility within that. And as you said, hopefully the project that we're doing will start to provide some evidence towards the magnitude of some of those value streams. Before we kind of switch to the questions from the audience, and thanks a lot for all the questions. We're just looking through that. So I just have one more question, and then we can switch to the audience questions. Again, I just want to get a little bit more information on, I guess, the role of your respective organizations in terms of what you're doing in the development of local energy systems. Maybe Steve, if I can start with you, in terms of the kind of DNO, DSO role and that evolution going forward. What would you say, how do you see, I guess, the role of kind of DNO and DSOs evolving in the future of local energy systems? And kind of, I guess, how important is kind of coordination with other actors, which has kind of already been touched upon a little bit?
Yeah, I think, as natural monopolies, clearly we need to be neutral facilitators of the emerging flexibility market. So we may be procurers of flexibility as required, but not providers in case we distort the market. And we should allow local energy systems to proliferate, working with them to ensure they've got the requirements. For example, I mentioned data and network visibility to flourish under these new market conditions. I do absolutely agree with Rick that there are significant barriers, and we need to kind of help support removing some of those in order to see these new markets grow. And I think that kind of coordination with local authorities is absolutely essential, as many of the decisions that we need to make about the smart grid, they've got to be whole system decisions, that is incorporating the other energy vectors or infrastructure such as transport or heat. Those decisions are far too important for utilities to make on their own in their silos. So we need to be informed by regional development plans and energy strategies, and that's why we're increasingly involved with LEPs and energy hubs in the south and the Scottish Government in the north to work with them to help support their plans and to make decisions in the context of those, rather than just like I say, in our silos.
Thanks, Steve. I think that's really great to hear the importance of kind of coordination that you've highlighted, that it's just not possible for one kind of organization to do it. And yeah, really interesting to hear kind of all the work that you've said that's going on in that. Again, maybe similar perspective from Rick. I mean, Rick, as you kind of introduced the work, the local authority in some ways kind of the center of all of this. You have kind of economic development, well-being, environmental sustainability objectives, which in different ways the local energy system really touches upon. Given kind of all of these synergies in the remit that you have, what role do you see for local authorities in kind of now and going forward in terms of local energy systems? And to any of the, I guess, local authorities listening in, what would you be your kind of suggestions of how best to approach this?
Yeah, good question, Manu. I think there's the bottom line at the moment is, this is still quite a challenging area, and particularly to try and get your head around and understand, from a local authority perspective, of what does this mean for me, and where's the starting point. But I think the key is is starting and learning as you go. I mean, something we found from Flex London is there is a sort of a common journey, what we call the sort of flexibility journey, that organizations, can follow. And really that starts firstly with awareness. So, what is flexibility and why is it something we should be doing? Then that next question is, starting to understand your energy use, not dissimilar to thinking about energy efficiency. So how do we use that energy today? Do we have the data, and what are our future energy needs? And then, the final one is, well, what could we flex for to meet that need, and what are the sort of different technologies and tools that would be used to do that? So I think there is this awareness piece. I think the reality is a lot of local authorities will be doing, will be deploying flexibility right now, whether they sort of explicitly have realized or not, in terms of looking at storage or putting in electric vehicle charge points in the right location. So they are sort of starting to do it, and it's just kind of building on that. I think I just wanted to touch, the final thing was just on, on the value of data. I think while there is this uncertainty about certain value streams and business models maturing to support local authorities in their journey, one of the first things they can do, which is a real no-brainer, is getting the right data in place, making sure they have got that monitoring in place and that their data is usable. Something we found in Flex London was that the time it took to essentially identify the right and relevant data sets, pull them out of proprietary systems and actually get them into a sort of format that a solution provider could come and look at and actually propose a solution, that took a lot of time, and often the business case was sort of dead before it started, just due to the time that it had taken there. So starting now to look at data, it's going to be really, really critical to be able to understand the assets in a borough, and then try and understand some of those opportunities and try to stage the progression of activities that need to take place. Data is a really, really key one that I think all boroughs can start with now. But yeah, in answer to the first part of your question, it's absolutely clear that local authorities are going to play an increasingly important role, whether that's directly or through sort of third-party solution providers. And so this is something that that they need support with to better understand, and obviously that's going to come from collaboration with the DNOs and with Ofgem and others.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks, Rick. I think yeah, pretty comprehensive answers both on the role and what local authorities can start doing already. Focused on data, I think that's a really important point. I think that really opens up loads of avenues which you did not think possible, and yeah, makes a lot of sense. Maybe just switching to the audience questions. Thank you very much for everyone who's written in. I think we've had some very specific kind of data related questions. If Rick and Steve are okay, we might just pass those questions by straight after this webinar, and you can pick up bilaterally if that's okay. I'll try to pick up some of the high level questions thanks to my colleague Hannah, who's been looking at this. So maybe a couple of minutes, really quick reactions, I guess, Rick and Steve. Maybe Rick, starting with you. All of this, as we said, there's a lot of value stacks. It's really important for local system development. It's tailored. How do we ensure that fuel poor households are not left behind? How do we make sure local energy system kind of is inclusive?
It's a really good question. I think there are a few quick things you can sort of start to do there. I think giving sort of some separate attention to those in fuel poor, and I appreciate identifying them is firstly a challenge, but making sure that they are front and center in any of these discussions is really key. So that could be, one example could be perhaps prioritizing them, in terms of a DNO sort of order of hierarchy, in terms of they're the ones that get to accrue that revenue from the DNO in terms of the flexibility they're providing. But also this is really key question around the digital sort of exclusion question alongside fuel poverty, which is a lot of these flexibility technologies are predicated on the need for the right digital technology and connectivity. Fuel poverty, that's something which really needs to be considered to make sure that actually certain people aren't excluded from participating in these future markets.
Understood. Thanks, Rick. And maybe one question quickly to get your reaction, Steve. I mean, are there any new technologies we should be looking out for? We spoke a lot about the importance of data. with, of course, there's no discussion that's complete without talking about AI or machine learning. How important enablers are they? How important is this to local energy systems?
Yeah, well, technology's kind of growing exponentially in terms of, in the past when we were looking at utilizing flexibility, we had to install technology at site, but now we can do that with APIs. So increasingly AI APIs, all those areas are kind of facilitating more involvement in flexibility and these local energy systems without kind of huge levels of cost, and that's really going to accelerate things. Just on the fuel poor thing that you mentioned there, ourselves and WPD have got a project with the Centre for Sustainable Energy called Smart and Fair, which is actually looking at it's built a kind of capability lens for the population to see for some of these smart grid offers how people can or what people need to kind of play in those markets, so you can highlight where the issues are, and then put in place mitigation to kind of support people accessing those markets. So that would be a good one to look out for in the future.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Steve. And I think given that we're coming quite close to this, I think I'll just take this opportunity to say, many thanks to Rick and Steve for presentations, but also running through these questions patiently. I think, really helpful, and it's helped me get a much better kind of understanding, I guess, of local energy systems and framing, especially trying to pull together the different perspectives of a DNO local authority together. That's been really helpful. And thanks to everyone who kind of sent questions. I think those we've not been able to address, we'll try to pick that up separately and perhaps pick that up by email or a separate discussion. And we'll also pass on the specific questions to the panelists after this. So I think I'll just hand over back to Andy Lever now to wrap up and close.
Super. Thank you, Manu. And also thank you to Rick and Steve. That was a good discussion, and I'm sure we could have gone on much longer, but thanks again. So just moving on to kind of what's in store next. If just go to the next slide, thanks. As I mentioned at the start, this is one of a series of 3 webinars. Next Tuesday, we'll be joined at the same time to focus in on transport and how role of flexibility in decarbonising that particular sector, joined by Evie and Vincent from UKPN and EDF respectively. And then on the following Tuesday, focusing in on decarbonising heat, and again, the role that flexibility can play in doing that as well. I'm very pleased to be joined by Matt and Keith from WPD and the Institution of Gas Engineers and Managers. So those will be coming up in the next couple of weeks as well. Next slide, please. I think, I guess, first of all, thank you for listening and engaging with the webinar. The recordings for all 3 webinars will be emailed to all attendees at the end of the series, so after the 3rd webinar. You can, of course, sign up to the next 2 webinars through our newsletter and at the website, www.carbontrust.com. If you'd like to email us directly, the Energy Systems team, then we have a specific email inbox there that you can connect to us on. And please do give us our feedback. There will be a pop-up box at the end of the webinar, which will take just a short few minutes to fill out, but be very appreciative of how you felt this session went today. Thank you again from me for listening, and I hope you found it enjoyable, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.